No one leaves this evil farm. In early 2014, deputies from a small sheriff's department in rural Oregon launched a search of a remote 20-acre farm buried deep within the forest. A local man had recently gone missing, and this farm was one of the last known places he had visited. While circling the perimeter of a large barn on the property, a deputy noticed something unusual on the ground. At first glance, it was hard to make out, but as he stepped closer, the shape resolved into something far more disturbing. What he had found would not only dominate national headlines, but would unravel a series of chilling revelations, exposing something far more sinister lurking in that quiet little town. By most standards, Susan Monica's life was a good one. She had a close-knit group of friends, a successful career as an engineer, and she lived in one of America's most iconic cities, San Francisco. But none of that made her happy. To Susan, city life was more obligation than choice. Her true nature craved isolation, simplicity, and silence, things nearly impossible to find in the noisy sprawl of the Bay Area. Many evenings, she would return to her apartment, sit by the window, and fantasize about a different life, one far removed from the chaos of civilization. She imagined a farm in the wilderness where she could raise her own food, live off the land, and answer to no one. In 1991, at 43 years old, she made that dream a reality. She purchased 20 acres of thick forest land near the small town of Weimar, Oregon. Though she called it a farm, the land was nothing more than raw, untamed wilderness. There was no house, no barn, no utilities, just trees and silence. To most, it would have been a daunting prospect. But to Susan, it was perfect. She welcomed the challenge. As an engineer, she had the skills to design and build everything she would need. And as a strong, determined woman, she was not afraid of the physical labor ahead. The first time she stood at the edge of her new property, gazing out at the dense forest and uneven terrain, she felt a profound sense of belonging. Despite the absence of shelter, power, or water, it already felt like home. Over the following months, Susan transformed her patch of wilderness into a functional homestead. She constructed a modest shack to live in, a large barn, and pens for livestock. But once everything was built, she quickly realized that keeping it all running was far harder than building it. Running a farm alone meant long, grueling days. Feeding animals, repairing structures, managing supplies, it was too much for one person. Reluctantly, Susan acknowledged she couldn't do it all herself. So, she began hiring help. She posted help wanted flyers throughout the town. Soon, workers began trickling in. Most of them down on their luck, drifting from job to job, some with criminal past. Susan didn't care. All she wanted was for them to do their work, respect her privacy, and leave her in peace. And for the most part, that's exactly what they did. Over the next 20 years, Susan hired hundreds of temporary workers. Most stayed for only a short time before drifting off again, and Susan never heard from them afterward. That pattern continued until the winter of 2014. By 2014, Susan Monica was 66 years old and living alone on her secluded farm when something unusual happened. She was outside near her shack, tending to chores in the driveway, when she looked up and noticed a car making its way up her long, winding road. This was no ordinary occurrence. Living in the middle of nowhere, Susan almost never had unannounced visitors. She watched intently as the vehicle pulled into her driveway, and 3 young people, 2 men and a woman, stepped out. Before she could ask who they were or why they were there, the group introduced themselves. They said they were looking for their father, Robert Haney. According to them, Robert had told the family he was working on Susan's farm in exchange for some cash and a place to park his camper. He had been living there. They explained that it had been months since they last heard from him. Though he didn't have a cell phone or a permanent address, Robert always managed to check in every couple of months. Until recently. Now, with no word from him in a long time, they were growing worried and decided to track him down themselves. Susan immediately recognized the name. She told them that yes, she remembered Robert Haney. She had hired him the previous spring to help build a structure on her property. At first, she said, Robert had been a good worker, quiet, respectful, and dependable. He even had a dog that Susan grew fond of. But by August, 5 months into his stay, things began to shift. Robert started drinking heavily. He worked less and spent more time ranting outside his camper, often yelling about getting revenge on someone. Eventually, Susan learned the reason behind his distress. One of Robert's children had been assaulted, and he felt overwhelming guilt for not having been there to protect them. His grief turned inward, and he seemed to spiral into obsession and despair. Susan understood his pain, but his behavior had become disruptive. She valued her peace and isolation above all else, and she knew she would have to confront him, and possibly ask him to leave, if things didn't improve. But before she had the chance, Robert showed up at her shack one day, handed her an envelope filled with cash, and asked if she'd take care of his dog for a while. Caught off guard, Susan agreed. Robert nodded his thanks, turned, and walked away. Moments later, Susan watched as he climbed into a white car that had just arrived at the edge of her property. She didn't recognize the car or see who was inside. Without another word, the vehicle turned around and drove off. That was back in September, 4 months earlier. She hadn't seen or heard from Robert since. Susan told the children that most of Robert's belongings were still inside his camper. She led them to where it was parked, and they went inside. Sure enough, his things were everywhere. Clothes, personal items, food supplies. But one item in particular alarmed them: his tool belt. Robert made his living as a traveling handyman. His tool belt was essential. He never went anywhere without it. Leaving it behind made no sense. It was as if he had planned to return, but never did. After inspecting the camper, the children thanked Susan and asked her to get in touch if she heard anything new. She agreed, and they drove off toward the Jackson County Sheriff's Office to file a missing person report. At the station, the response was sympathetic but not encouraging. The officers explained that it would be difficult to locate someone like Robert. With no phone, no permanent address, and no recent financial activity, there was little to track. Still, they agreed his sudden disappearance, and the circumstances around it, warranted concern, especially given the last people to see him alive had witnessed him unraveling. When the sheriff and his deputies learned that Robert Haney had been speaking frequently about revenge before he vanished, they feared the worst, that Robert had acted on those threats and had gone into hiding after committing a violent crime. With no phone, address, or traceable contacts, they had little to go on. But then, one of Robert's kids mentioned something that gave investigators their first real lead: his EBT card. EBT, or electronic benefit transfer, is used like a debit card to access government-issued welfare benefits. Crucially, it's trackable. A few days later, the trace came back. The card had been used just a month earlier at a Walmart located about 30 minutes southwest of Susan Monica's farm. Investigators went straight to the Walmart and were led to the security office to review surveillance footage from the date of the transaction. Hours of footage were combed through, but Robert never appeared. Instead, they spotted someone else: Susan Monica, standing at the checkout using Robert's EBT card. It was a stunning discovery. Suspicion immediately shifted. Investigators rushed back to the station and began preparing a search warrant for Susan's property. On January 10th, the sheriff and his deputies arrived at Susan Monica's remote farm. As their convoy pulled into her driveway, Susan came out to meet them, visibly surprised. When she asked what was going on, the sheriff told her plainly, "We're here to search your property in connection with Robert Haney's disappearance." Before she could respond, the sheriff added, "Let's talk inside." Susan, now visibly nervous, led him into her home while deputies fanned out to search the property. In Susan's kitchen, the sheriff got straight to the point. "We have you on surveillance camera using Robert's EBT card. That's a felony. So I need you to tell me, where is Robert Haney?" For a moment, Susan's face fell into shock. Then, surprisingly, her expression relaxed. She claimed that she hadn't stolen anything. She said Robert gave her the EBT card along with a wad of cash when he left months ago. He asked her to look after his dog and told her to use the card to buy dog food if she needed to. Susan insisted that she only used the card because the cash eventually ran out. She also added that if she'd stolen it, she wouldn't have been able to use it. You need the pin, and Robert had given her that too. The sheriff wasn't entirely convinced, but Susan stayed firm. After several minutes of questioning, he began to believe she might be telling the truth. Without any concrete proof of wrongdoing, the EBT card angle appeared to be a dead end. But just as the sheriff was about to leave, a deputy came sprinting inside. He leaned down and whispered something into the sheriff's ear. Whatever he said made the sheriff's face twist in disgust. When the deputy left, the sheriff turned to Susan and quietly said, "Ma'am, you're going to have to come with us." At the station, Susan was brought into a small interrogation room. She looked pale, nervous, and disoriented. The sheriff entered, hit the record button, and sat down across from her. Then he asked, "Has anyone died on your property?" What Susan told them next would not only make national headlines, but also shock even the most seasoned investigators. Susan began by reiterating everything she'd previously said about Robert's departure, but then admitted she had left something out. She claimed that after Robert handed her the envelope of cash and climbed into the white car, he had actually returned to the farm sometime later, unexpectedly and unannounced. One morning, Susan went out to feed her animals. As she neared the pig pen, she noticed something strange. The pigs, usually lazing about at that hour, had all gathered tightly in one area. They were huddled around something, jostling for position. It looked like they were feeding. Susan rushed over, alarmed. She climbed into the pen and began pushing pigs aside. And then she saw it. Robert Haney was lying on his back. His abdomen had been ripped open, and the pigs were eating him. But the most horrifying part? He was still alive. Robert was groaning, barely moving. His body was half consumed, disemboweled, but somehow clinging to life. Susan tried to pull the pigs away, but they were in a frenzy, biting and clawing to get back to the body. Susan said she thought about moving him, but she could see he was nearly split in two. She feared that if she tried, she would kill him in the process. Susan Monica told the sheriff she had only omitted one detail, but that detail was horrific. After discovering Robert Haney being eaten alive by her pigs, she said she ran to her barn, grabbed her shotgun, and rushed back to the pen. Robert was barely conscious, groaning, his body mangled. Susan raised the gun, aimed, and fired. She told the sheriff it was an act of mercy. She couldn't bear to see him suffer any longer. 3 days passed before she returned to the pig pen. By then there was almost nothing left. She said she gathered the remaining body parts, scraps the pigs hadn't consumed, placed them into plastic bags, and tossed them onto a trash pile in her barn. But clearly, Robert's remains hadn't stayed there, because the thing the deputy had whispered into the sheriff's ear earlier was this: "Sir, we found a leg. Outside." It was Robert's leg, lying out in the open on Susan's property, not in the barn. When Susan was confronted with this, she casually suggested that maybe a wild animal had dragged it out. The sheriff, stunned, could barely respond. "Why didn't you call 911?" he asked. "When you first saw Robert, maybe we could have saved him. Or at least after he died." Susan replied coldly, "If word got out about what happened, my pigs might be euthanized. I sell their meat. Even if they weren't put down, people in town wouldn't buy from me anymore." Susan then told the sheriff where to find the bags containing Robert's remains. She even agreed to take a polygraph to prove she was now telling the truth. But when the test began, she constantly fidgeted, sighed loudly, yawned, and coughed. Her behavior threw off the reading so badly that the first test was inconclusive. They tried again, and again. She disrupted the process. Finally, the investigators stopped the test altogether. At that point, they warned her, "We're going to search your farm. If there's anything else you haven't told us about, now's your chance." Susan stopped fidgeting. Then, slowly, she picked up a pen and a sheet of paper. In silence, she began drawing a map of her farm. Once finished, she placed a large X on a specific spot and slid the paper across the table. "If you go to that X," she said, "you'll find Stephen." The investigators stared at her. "Stephen? Who's Stephen?" "We're talking about Robert." But Susan had more secrets to share. A year before hiring Robert Haney, Susan had employed another handyman, Stephen Delacino. Like Robert, he was quiet, hardworking, and kept mostly to himself. But eventually, Susan grew suspicious. She believed Stephen was stealing her guns from the barn. One day, she confronted him. According to Susan, the two got into a heated argument which escalated quickly. She claimed she couldn't remember all the details, but during the scuffle, a gun went off. Stephen collapsed in the middle of the pig pen, bleeding from the head. And then, just like with Robert, the pigs swarmed him. They began eating Stephen alive. Once again, Susan said she didn't call 911. Her reason was the same: fear for her pigs, fear for her livelihood, and fear of her reputation in town if people found out that her animals had developed a taste for human flesh. Despite how bizarre and ghastly Susan's stories were, investigators were never able to find evidence directly contradicting her version of events. But when she finally went to trial for the murders of Robert Haney and Stephen Delacino, the jury had heard enough. They didn't believe her. Not for a second. They were convinced Susan hadn't shot these men in moments of chaos or mercy. She had done it on purpose, in cold blood. Susan, who was known locally to have a fierce temper, likely murdered both men and then used her pigs to destroy the evidence. And we can only hope they were already dead before that happened. On April 21st, 2015, more than a year after Robert was first reported missing, Susan Monica was convicted of 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of abuse of a corpse. She was sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in prison. While in custody, she was reportedly overheard telling someone, "There are 17 other bodies buried on my property." Authorities returned to search the farm again, extensively, but no other remains were ever found.